Likewise.
Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, Auto World. I'm Jamie Butters, Executive Editor of... Oh, are we counting down? Okay, that's great. Thanks for your patience, everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, Auto World. I'm Jamie Butters, Executive Editor of Automotive News and host of the Daily Drive podcast. Welcome to this Automotive News Congress Conversation live stream. I'm in the Automotive News studio here at Brewery Park in Detroit. It's still a tariff world filled with uncertainty. President Trump has announced a lot of tariffs, not just for the auto industry, but also on metals and general trade. He's dialed some down, he's dialed some up. He's gotten offended, understandably, by the nickname for a new trading strategy. And some of his tariffs have been deemed illegal, though that ruling is still under appeal. There's a lot to sort out, and we've got just the pros here to help us to do it. The North American auto industry has been deeply intertwined for decades, more than half a century between the U.S. and Canada. How much will those supply chains have to be unraveled? Will there be enough workers where factories need to be? How long might it take to make any needed adjustments? Today, there's a moment of calm almost, that sort of eerie, eye of the hurricane kind of calm. No new tweets or true social posts this morning, but there's a lot in flux and more challenges ahead than even what the industry is facing now. To help us get a handle on where the auto industry is at this point on June 3rd, 2025, I'm joined today by several special guests. Rodrigo Contreras is Global Director of Government Relations for Martinrea International, the big Canadian supplier. He joins us from Toronto. Bonjour, buenos dias, Rodrigo.
Bonjour, thank you for the invitation, Jamie.
Mitch Zajac is a shareholder and a member of the Automotive Practice Group at Butzel, the large and well-known 170-year-old law firm. He's at the Detroit office. Hi, Mitch.
Hey, Jamie. Good morning. Good afternoon.
All right, and from MEMA Original Equipment Suppliers, we have Colin Shaw coming to us from Auburn Hills, I believe, north of Detroit, where supplier relations are always an issue. Colin, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here, Jamie. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
All right, and finally, my colleague Greg Layson from Automotive News Canada. What's up, Greg?
Not much, just as warm as you are north of the border. Looking forward to this conversation.
Whew, balmy today here in Detroit.
It is.
Well, we're going to have a great conversation today, and we want you and the audience to be a part of it. Say hi in the chat and tell us where you are. It's always fun to see the breadth of our audience. But even better, you know, if you have questions, put them in the chat. We'll do our best to get you an answer. To start us off, Mitch, where do we stand with the tariffs, and particularly that appeal, the Court of International Trade's ruling that the so-called reciprocal tariffs were not imposed properly?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. It's really an interesting storyline because we have not only the case that was issued in the CIT, but also a decision from the U.S. District Court in Washington, D.C. on a similar issue. As we've seen in the news, the Court of International Trade's opinion has essentially been stayed from enforcement by the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which essentially means the Court of Appeals is working its way over the next couple of weeks to understand the issue, receive additional arguments and briefs from the government, as well as from the private plaintiffs, as well as the state plaintiffs in that consolidated decision. And we'll wait to see the outcome of that. And most certainly we'll see likely an appeal to the Supreme Court. But it's not the only tariff news going on. I think you mentioned Truth Social in your windup here. And on Friday, there was a Truth Social comment about steel and aluminum tariffs and how as of Friday going on tomorrow, June 4th, there will be an increase. We've not seen any official documents, no notices on the Federal Register or CSMS messages, but an indication, as has been the case in other implementations of tariffs, an indication that tariffs will go up. So, more to come, hopefully this afternoon on steel and aluminum, and sometime before we have a final outcome on the global reciprocal tariffs and the related trafficking tariffs that were the subject of those two cases.
We actually already have a question from the audience. Greg, we'll get to your question shortly, but Jan is asking. I mean, are these 50% steel tariffs likely to stick? Is that maybe just negotiating, or are they the types that are likely to stick around?
I mean, reading the tea leaves, as I think we've all started to become experts at, is we see a strong push from a negotiating perspective, and even the decision we talked about with the reciprocal tariffs. The Court of International Trade said essentially, we don't disagree with your wisdom here, and using this as a leverage tool to negotiate and keep a strong position for the United States. But under the IEEPA, in that instance, this is not allowed. That was their opinion. Different, though, is the steel and aluminum tariffs, the related automotive parts and automobiles tariffs under Section 232, which have been tested over the last, since Trump administration #1, and they've found to be able to be upheld. So in terms of, are they illegal? The question is likely that there is some strength behind them. The question of, will he keep them forever? That is the tea leaf reading, and I think personally it's negotiating. But of course, the outcome will be what it is, and he'll have, and the administration will have their own kind of motivations and use it as a tool, perhaps to adjust other trade-related matters from country to country, or USMCA or the like.
Greg, fire away.
Yeah, I'm curious. I look back when all this chaos began, and I had Linda Hassenfratz, executive chair of Linamar, on my podcast, and she said, the worst case scenario and what was likely to happen is the auto industry shuts down within 2 weeks. And now here we are entering June. That hasn't happened. Why has that not happened? What is different today than what we were preparing for back in, say, February and March? And maybe, Rodrigo, we could start with you.
Sure, Greg. Well, I think at the end of the day, the harsh imposition on tariffs, and I think the agreement that the auto sector reached with the U.S. administration, I'm talking about the discussions, the OEMs, and of course the work that MEMA has been doing, and what Canada and Mexico have been doing, has allowed the continuation of auto manufacturing to continue. Of course, as you understand, there were preparations of the auto sector when these tariffs were a threat. When they occurred, again, the discussions, negotiations happened, and we're, I would say, in a state of the harsher tariffs for automotive. Definitely the recognition of the USMCA is very key and very important. And at the end of the day, that is what has avoiding this catastrophic situation to have happen, that Linda, and I would say my boss, has also stated very publicly on the matter. So we think that that's the case, and just throughout a comment, I think this element of uncertainty is something that we should be rapidly be addressing, and I think the sector is very much aligned to start with those conversations. I hope I respond to your question, Greg.
Yep. Colin, I'm curious. President, and Jamie touched on this off the top, President Trump tells us that the reason for the tariffs is to bring jobs back to America. He's accused Canada and Mexico of stealing those auto jobs. I suppose anything's possible that all the jobs could come back to America, but I have sort of a two-part question. How long would it take to move the entire industry to America? Is that even possible? And new numbers out today project that unemployment in America is going to be 4.2%. That doesn't seem like there's a lot of people to do the jobs that the president is trying to reshore to America. Is this even possible on a long-term and large scale?
So I do want to address one topic. So this bringing manufacturing back to America. Manufacturing exists in the United States. So we've been doing supply chain studies for the last decade. And our most recent one, we compared 2019 to 2023. And manufacturing supplier jobs have grown 1.7% since then. Some sectors more than others. But suppliers in the automotive industry have been part of continuing to grow manufacturing in the United States. We support directly 930,000 manufacturing jobs in the United States, 4.5 million indirect jobs. So this notion of bringing manufacturing back is not, there's some nuances to that. I try to pose it of, we're continuing to grow manufacturing. Now, when it comes to how quick we can do this, realistically, just to build one factory, it's usually a 3 to 5 year process. And that's for a greenfield. Brownfield could be a little bit slower, could be longer, depending on approvals, but it takes a lot of time. Now, I think you pose an interesting question of, and this is one we've been asking ourselves in our supply base in response to some questions, by the administration, is what is the art of the possible? What are supply chains we ought to focus on? And are there supply chains that probably are not coming back to the United States? And that's a valid question. And there are supply chains that don't exist. So when you think about some of the electronic supply chains, some of the precious metals, things like wire harnesses, seating, cut, sew, trim, those kind of things don't exist in the United States. And there's a question of what is the art of the possible? Things like wire harnesses, seating, it's probably unlikely that some of those supply chains are coming back to the United States. Very labor intensive. And that's why we have an agreement like USMCA. Each country brings something unique to the table. Each country brings an ability to make this region competitive with manufacturing. So things like that, where there's 500,000 people maybe employed in Mexico and Central America and those things, probably not coming back to the United States. Other things like electronics, some of the precious metals. People may not know that up until 20 years ago, California had the largest neodymium mine in the world. Doesn't really exist anymore. We have access, we have ample supply. So there are other supply chains that, as we talk to the administration, that could come back. Now it's gonna require a longer term view of things. It takes a long time to build fabrication plants. It takes a long time to rebuild electronics and that industry. And it's going to take coordination with Canada, Mexico, the United States, probably some other trading partners. And I more look at it as, how do we diversify the risk we have in a supply chain in automotive? How do we not be so dependent on one market that may turn that off? So it's going to take a long-term view. Suppliers need stability. It's going to take multiple of years to bring those things back. And it's going to take working with the OEMs, suppliers, government to really identify how to do that. I do think there are people that would work in those jobs. That job is going to change very drastically over the next 10 years. It's not going to just be get out of high school, go work at a factory, or have a 2-year. You may need a 4-year degree. So the nature of those jobs is also going to change to account for things like AI, automation, highly automated plants and things like that.
So the follow-up to that, and briefly we'll start with Rodrigo and then we'll go to Mitch for his opinion. Is this ultimately about reshoring jobs, or is this about securing future investment? And I look at Canada, and I've been saying to some of my colleagues and some of the folks I talk to that this is about maintaining our footprint. I don't think Canada was ever on pace to get or slated for a brand new assembly plant. So is this about any new investment going to America? Rodrigo, we'll start with you. Is that really what this is about, rather than bringing back what isn't there?
So, in our view, and of course, Martinrea has always stood for fair and free trade, and of course, we've looked to understand the policies of the U.S. administration on this. We do believe that the issue is, how do we secure our value chains within the North American region? Because there's very specific competitors that could affect the future of this critical industry to North America. Some address those markets as entities of concern, or some others may be specifically referred to as China. No, but at the end of the day, I think the pandemic was very key for this, let's call it, evolution of the decision making process, no, and understanding the constraints that we had during the pandemic to get these key supplies in to North America and continue with the normality of our value chains really is number one part of the objective. No, second, definitely there has been a shift in the technologies within auto, and I'm not only talking about how the propulsion behind the auto, but as Colin is saying, the innovation part of it, the integration of artificial intelligence and other mechanisms into the manufacturing floor. There's this new wave opportunity that we need to capitalize in North America. Colin is mentioning there's room for Canada, there's room for Mexico, there's room for other economies could contribute to this. But in short, and as a company that is North American centric, we do believe that we need to create those critical and key processes that will ensure the future of auto in this region. Now, that will connect with, yes, new investments on, let's say, or new decision-making processes for the OEMs. But at the end of the day, what we need to build here, and with the mechanisms that are being that surround, for instance, this announcement from the administration on the new big deal, no, they need to match with the possibilities of constructing this critical and key manufacturing and support processes within the United States and within the North American region.
Mitch, is it about bringing jobs back, or is it about securing future investment? Is it keeping Canada and Mexico where they are and increasing America's presence?
Yeah, I think that at the end of the day, that's the goal of the administration, is to increase the American presence. I do think that there's a lot of interesting changes in the automotive industry, and to me, we go back to the driverless car kind of concept in the era pre-Trump administration one, where you see an influx of tech companies migrating to become automotive companies, and then you have the geographies associated with that, and the skill and education and different kind of perspective on manufacturing at times that's associated with that, and they're key players now in the automotive industry, and so that's part of the conversation. But three key aspects: time, cost, and skill, I think are factors. And when you start talking about things coming to America, the biggest thing that stands out to me is the cost piece, because it starts at the consumer, right? And then it works its way to the end manufacturer. So in our space, it's the OEMs who have certain price points that drive certain decisions that the suppliers, tier one, have to make down to tier two and to tier three. And if not for that final OEM kind of perspective on this is what the cost is allowed to be, there would be more flexibility perhaps with the suppliers. And so we're seeing situations where there's opportunity even under these tariffs to manufacture cars in the U.S. I have a client that supplies the entire assembly line for auto manufacturers. The problem is those the subcomponents come from outside of the U.S. So we could enable automotive manufacturing in the U.S., but it's cost prohibitive because to get the stuff here to do it, it's very, very expensive. Or local large family-owned business in Wisconsin. Again, they manufacture the products that they sell to OEMs across the world here in the U.S. They do buy subcomponents from outside the U.S., and so the cost implications there are significant. So I think they all have to play together. I do believe, though, to get back to the first question, that the goal is to do more things here and not necessarily take away. And I think the administration, really through Colin and his team and all of MEMA and the work they're doing to educate new administration members or existing Congress folks about the nuances of the automotive industry, I think that that's key, and it's helping, to Rodrigo's point earlier, allow for too swift of change not to occur so as to collapse the industry. And so certainly praise Colin and his team for that work.
Thank you, Mitch. Appreciate it.
I am curious, though, if it's about investment, how does business confidence get restored following all of this chaos, all of these changes? And if you invest in America and then suddenly tariffs are gone and now it would have been more cost effective to invest in Canada or Mexico. How does this reconcile itself moving forward? It seems that some of the confidence in America in terms of doing business and in trust has been eroded. How do we get past that? And maybe Colin, you could start.
Yeah, it's definitely been shaken. I'm in a fortunate position where I get to talk to a lot of incredibly smart people, some very amazing leaders, and it has been shaken. The number one piece of feedback I get from people is, above anything, this industry is full of incredibly bright people, incredibly capable people at all levels of every organization. But without stability and long-term understanding of what's needed, we can't be successful. We can deal with almost anything. As you've seen, there are predictions this industry would shut down in 2 weeks. We're still here. We're still doing everything we can. We're still selling cars. We're still making cars. This is an incredibly tough industry. And if we don't have that stability, that shakes the foundation. And that's going to mean, some of these things that are playing out in courts, that does provide a little more stability in the long run. Now, these things take time. When the court ruling came out on Friday, I was contacted immediately by a number of media, and I said, this is, you gotta be patient. This is not the end game here. This is just a warning shot. We got to be patient, and we got to let things play out. So some of these things are going to take a little time, and that is going to be frustrating, I think. And it's going to take a lot of time to make sure that we restore the faith and confidence in the business decisions. And that's going to mean some of these things go into effect in things like a tax bill, run through the courts, because that's how things become a little more codified and become more stable for people to make those long-term decisions.
We have a comment from Michael on LinkedIn saying, supply chain security is national security, as evidenced by the post-COVID mess. I would also add, sometimes it's about regional security, not just national security. And I make that point in part to pivot. There's a lot of noise in the system right now, and some things are starting to get sorted out. But we know, there's all these deals that are trying to be made with the UK, with Japan, Korea, European Union, and so on. Even if all that gets settled, even when all that gets settled, we have another big hurdle, which is the renegotiation of the USMCA. This past weekend, I was at the Detroit Grand Prix. I had the chance to talk with Lance Wolfer, who heads up sales for Honda and Acura here in North America. Here's what was on his mind.
We're looking for a revision and quick look at USMCA so that it gets adjusted to where it needs to from the administration standpoint, and we're able to then build towards whatever that future is.
All right, so let me ask you, Rodrigo, first, and then Colin, what are you hoping to see out of the new USMCA?
Well, first of all, we agree with the comments from the gentleman from Honda. We would like to see a rapid, or let's say, with the least amount of time review on USMCA. At the end of the day, going back to Colin's comment and a little bit of the comments I made, yes, there's the element of value chain integration, security, of course, the element of reaching deals that would generate more jobs in the United States, fully understood. But at the end of the day, this time that Colin talks about, it adds to the uncertainty and it adds to the competition. So what we want to see is of course, the sit down between the two countries, and we need to recognize, and I apologize for the rest of the industrial sectors, but auto is the most important transactional sector within the USMCA. So we need to sit down and resolve this for the purpose of eliminating the uncertainty, reaching and being able to accomplish what the United States want to reach as goals in relation to regional value content, or specifically United States content. Number two is encouraging fair trade and of course aligning between the three countries on potential unfair trade practices from entities of concern, which we believe that's also part of the elements that the U.S. administration wants to see included within USMCA. And at the end of the day, how do we address what are the strategic elements in which will have to be developed in the United States for competitiveness, but as well as what does Canada and Mexico should add to the equation of maintaining the competitive nature of the auto sector for now and for the future in North America.
Colin, anything to add?
Yeah, I think adding on to that, first, I think USMCA has been successful. And like any good relationship or agreement, you got to go back and look at it. All of our relationships have changed over time, whether it be marriage, friendships. This is another one of those. But let me give you some numbers. I think it's been successful. And one of the markets that I'm responsible for is also heavy commercial vehicle. And this is a market that's probably even more reliant on USMCA and is more regional than the passenger car market. Now, they grew employment at a 6% clip from 2019 to 2023. It's a very regional part of our market. They really heavily lean on USMCA, and 90+% of heavy commercial vehicles are built in the USMCA region. So when structured properly, we can be successful all together. We all grew employment at that time, and we grew it at a greater clip than employment throughout the country. So as we go back and look at it, yes, there are things like proper and fair competition. The elephant in the room is China. We hear that from everybody. Do they have access to capital that is at rates lower than everybody else? And does that limit competition? Okay, we'll look at that. Other things like looking at the core components, how do we look at batteries and safety equipment in USMCA? There will be discussions on regional value content and labor rates. But at the core of it, we have to go back and remember and look at the numbers and say, yeah, this was successful. This did what it was supposed to do. It drove investment into the United States. Automotive suppliers in the automotive industry is the #1 attractor of foreign direct investment in the United States, period. So we do our part. We drive investment. And a big part of that is some of the trade deals that we've struck, specifically USMCA. So we need to go back. We need to look at it and make sure things are appropriate. We need to ensure fair competition in the region. But ultimately, I think we'll show that President Trump's landmark bill here was successful, will continue to be successful. We just need to make a few changes to it and make sure that over the next 20 years, it continues to meet the needs of each of the markets that it represents.
I know we're going to talk a lot more about that in the coming months, if not yet more today. I do want to make sure to touch on some things as we round the corner here at the bottom of the hour. Some folks might have to go, but we're going to keep pushing on for a while. I do want to make sure the audience knows about some important events we have coming up at Automotive News. You won't want to miss the 2025 Automotive News Congress. That's where you'll hear more great conversations like this one. Confirmed keynote speakers include General Motors CEO Mary Barra, Hyundai Motor Group Executive Chair Yusin Chung. We have panelists, including top executives like Paul Thomas from Bosch and Aruna Anand from Continental Automotive, soon to be known as Aumovio. I'm still getting used to that name, but it's a serious company. Jonathan Smoke from Cox Automotive, John Murphy from Bank of America. Colin's going to be back with us. Really too many luminaries to name them all, but you won't want to miss it. You can buy your tickets at autonews.com. I think you want to look for autonewsevents.com. Also, for local Detroit folks, the Automotive Golf Classic is coming up June 16th. That's the day after Father's Day. It's at St. John's Resort and the Cardinal in Plymouth, Michigan. Benefits the Boys and Girls Clubs of Southeast Michigan, and it's organized by our own Phil Nussel. I know there's been some chaos among the local auto-oriented golf outings, so if you're looking for a chance to have some fun, give to a good cause, here's one that also kicks off with a supplier panel discussion. Lots of good auto folks are going to be there. So we still have questions in the queue. So Rodrigo, Colin, Mitch, if you guys are willing to stick around with us a little longer, we'll push on a while. Great.
Sure thing.
Excellent. All right. Well, let's see. First of all, question from Jason. I think looking at kind of the way the trends have been going, how is the North American auto industry, in particular the U.S. OEMs, supposed to survive on as little as 16 million vehicles a year? If North America looks only inward, has it effectively given up competing globally? I don't know. Maybe this starts with Colin, but anyone who wants to take a shot at it.
Yeah, I think, at the heart of what we're trying to accomplish here, and I think at the heart of what the Trump administration is trying to do, is improve the competitiveness of manufacturing in North America, and thereby the companies that exist here in North America. It is true, though, if you're not building cars for a global market, you're not going to be globally successful. And, to a degree, we have become a little bit insular in some of the vehicles that we produce, large SUVs, pickups. Maybe some of the global appeal of that changes with EVs, just because of their large CO2 and fuel economy footprint around the world. But ultimately, we need to also think about the vehicles we produce here. Now, I'm fortunate because I get to think about the supplier side. The suppliers, if we can make sure that we're competitive in the United States globally, suppliers can export anywhere. And they have a wonderful opportunity, I think, to capitalize on some of this to make sure, they can support markets like Europe, Japan, Korea, even China. These global markets are incredibly important. And we have a lot of suppliers that are incredibly successful there. So if we can continue to do that, I do see a bright spot for the supplier industry. And I do think that ultimately our OEMs here can be successful, but we need to also make sure that we're looking globally to make sure that the vehicles and products we're building match a global market, because I'm a little concerned right now. We're a little bit biased towards passenger car, and what you'll see is something like in commercial vehicle where, the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Australia, they use one type of commercial vehicle, and the rest of the world uses a different type, and again, has become a little bit insular to this region.
Well,
Yeah, I would agree with that if I could. I mean, I would agree with that in the sense that suppliers are selling to customers that are also global, right? GM Shanghai is still part of General Motors, and Fiat is part of Stellantis, and the list goes on. So I think that from a supplier perspective, which, like Colin, is where I focus most of my work too, it is continued opportunity regardless of what comes from the entire volume of sales in the US, because there's still automobiles being manufactured by the same customers under perhaps slightly different names all around the world.
As we think about possible renegotiation in North America, we have a couple of questions or comments that kind of fit. I know it's hard to project too far into the future, but Jordan is asking on YouTube, will we see more manufacturing go, and this kind of asking a sort of Greg's question, right? Will we see manufacturing come to the U.S., or will it end up more, nearshored in Canada and Mexico, which I think really comes back to how the USMCA gets renegotiated. Kind of along the same lines, Toby asks, will tariffs reshaping global auto supply chain, do you think this will spark real investment in local manufacturing or just smarter loopholes? Sorry, Mitch, I have to go to you. You're the lawyer. Are we going to see smarter exploitation of loopholes?
Yeah, the more complex it gets, the more job security I suppose I have. Some of it is loopholes, and some of it is operating well within the system. With regards to importing into the U.S., there's key components. We have to classify the thing appropriately. We have to determine where it's coming from appropriately from a country of origin perspective, but we also have to value it appropriately. And under USMCA, there was no real need to really hone in on what the official value was, because it was coming over duty-free or tariff-free. So once tariffs came into effect, now all of a sudden it really matters what the value of this thing is, because the tariff is based on that value. And so we're seeing, hyper scrutiny, the creation of compliance teams, the aspect of not just relying on what necessarily your supplier says, but doing your own due diligence as a part of the process. We're also better understanding from a company perspective, what are these Incoterms? And like, when I put these words in this contract, do they actually mean anything? Well, when all of a sudden there is a real question of who bears the risk of import duties or the risk of loss through a transport, now it becomes really important what those words are. So sure, there will always, like a great tax attorney will always help you find a way to save a few extra bucks. There will always be opportunities to be efficient within the system, which might come off as a loophole. But at the same time, it is operating within the system in an efficient way to enable, playing by the rules and enable a kind of a leg up, if you will, if you're doing it that way.
Yeah, I also think that we have to remember that the automotive supply chain is made up of a lot of different supply chains. It's the most complex consumer product on the face of the earth. It's more complex than your house. There's approximately 30,000 parts that go into a vehicle. And the supply chain of a seat is vastly different than the supply chain of a battery, which is vastly different than the supply chain of an engine and transmission. And the economics of all these different supply chains are very different. And the economics have worked to employ 930,000 people in manufacturing jobs in the United States, thousands of people in Mexico and Canada. And it depends on the right supply chain. Obviously there are some supply chains that are more robust in Mexico, some in the United States, and some in Canada. And the economics of them are all very different. And that's why it's imperative we have a USMCA agreement that works so that we can make sure the economics of these supply chains work. And that's why we've been successful as a region. And we have to understand, pick and choose and be a little smart. I was up at the Mackinac Policy Conference this week, and Governor Whitmer really pushing for chip fabrication in Michigan. Some of those they probably make sense to come back to the United States. Chips, fabs, some of the electronics. Other things make more sense in Mexico. Other things make more sense in Canada. I think there's a very robust minerals pipeline in Canada looking at batteries and how do we ensure that supply chain. So it's so hard to boil this industry down into one when it's every major supply chain outside of chemicals and probably pharmaceutical exists in an automobile.
And I will just circle everything that Mitch and Colin said. I think number one, agreeing fully on the compliance part, that will drive a lot of the, let's say, or part of the decision process on the increase of investments in the United States. I think we're seeing that from the OEMs. I think there's a perfect example to follow of what's happening to Nissan at the current time, right? Where they have this infrastructure set globally, and they're deciphering what is going to be best for the company, and if they're gonna. And I think they've gone into already two rounds of potential mergers and with other Japanese companies. But at the end of the day, part has to do with compliance. Part has to do with the capabilities of certain regions for specific or added value manufacturing, like Colin is mentioning. Maybe there's opportunities for supporting countries to provide those elements of competitiveness to what is being manufactured in the United States. And last but not least, what do the markets tell our OEMs, right? Where is the new drive for specific kinds of vehicles going into? We do see, I think, a global shift that is not very far away from what's happening within the United States market. And I think our OEMs within the United States need to define whether they're going to play a role in those international markets. One, for instance, concern is that you have an increase in market participation of Chinese brands within Mexico that grew from year 2022 to 2023 between 12 and 14%. So that's tremendous. So that is, I think, part of the definitions and mathematical equations we're going to have to see our OEMs do in the future.
That's such a good point about markets internationally and domestically. Like, what are the trends? We have a comment from a viewer on YouTube saying, for those retail point of view, right? For those on the front line facing the consumer, still having goals to hit and wheels to put in driveways is just another change in how and when consumers will buy cars. Staying educated gains trust. Always a good point, and we appreciate everyone throughout the entire auto value chain being here and staying up to date. Another follow-up, I think, kind of on, we talked about loopholes. We talked about the reciprocal tariff case at the Court of International Trade. And I think it's one of the things that's interesting. There are the sectoral tariffs on autos and auto parts, but not every auto part is defined as an auto part. And some of I think actuators and maybe even just some magnets and other, elements, things that go into cars are really taxed under those reciprocal tariffs or the, fentanyl and migrant tariffs. Mitch, how do you look at that? The question here is actually from Ben is, does the court ruling from last week expedite or delay clarity of the long-term tariff picture?
I think to Colin's point earlier, it at least puts it on a path towards clarity. Certainly you raise a great point, Jamie, that, of the 30,000 parts on a vehicle, the vast majority are not on the automotive parts list that is subject to Section 232 tariffs, and instead are potentially subject to global reciprocal tariffs, or are subject to those fentanyl and trafficking tariffs. And so, those are part of it. The reciprocal and the trafficking tariffs are part of that decision that is on its path towards clarity. But there's other options that the government has, whether it's moving more parts to Section 232, whether it's flexing further Section 301 and kind of this protection of intellectual property perspective, which is what has been in place against many Chinese products since the Trump 1 administration. And then there's a Section 122 that was referenced as, again, just another existing, more, I'll say, codified, as to use Colin's word, and more procedural approach to implementing tariffs than just a declaration of an emergency under IEPA. So I think that it will not deter the administration. Whatever the outcome is of this case, I don't think it will deter the administration from working to use tariffs as a point of leverage. It will change their approach, but certainly we'll have clarity on how quickly these emergencies can be declared and the like once these cases work their way through the system.
Greg, did you have a closing question for the panel?
Sure. Let's try and play a little fortune teller here. For each of you, how and when does this chaos end and we're back to quote unquote normal? Do you have any sense whatsoever? What can you tell our audience about what you're feeling, what you're seeing, and sort of what you predict? And we'll start at Mitch and go to Colin and end on Rodrigo.
Sure. I think that the largest countries in the world and the U.S. together have to reach some sort of trade agreements. I think that there's 20 or so that and I've seen this quote, this stat quoted around in many publications, if 20 of these countries reach deals with the U.S., it's over 85% of the GDP is accounted for from a trade perspective, and therefore the rest will kind of just follow along or won't be as significant. So I do think that it will require reaching a common ground. Now, what that is, I think, is up to the administration to feel like there is success in that outcome. I think that the Chinese kind of ceasefire, if you will, that has been being worked on, it's running into certain roadblocks with rare earth metals and other things. But if that were to happen, then you would see, I think, other major countries also fall in line to reach some sort of deal, and I think that's what would drive the most certainty. Obviously, USMCA being part of that.
Colin, any predictions?
Yeah, I think there's going to be pockets where we do get some certainty, but as a society, we're on the precipice of a lot of different changes. We may find some certainty in some of the regulatory areas, but we still need to deal with electrification. We still need to deal with the stranded capital that's out there. We still need to understand how consumers are going to purchase those. There are things like automation and autonomous driving that are still in the pipeline. Their, automated manufacturing. Having been to CES last year, seeing people with spinal cord injuries walk with the help of assisted robots. I mean, I think we're just barely on the precipice of some amazing changes when it comes to how we build and manufacture things. And so there's, like I said, there's going to be pockets of certainty. We may get some trade certainty, but innovation is on a rapid pace right now. And since the Industrial Revolution, innovation has not destroyed jobs; it's created opportunities. And I think those are the attitudes that I like to have in these kind of times. Yeah, it's tough, and I really empathize for our suppliers who are going through financial troubles right now, and that is real, and it's heartbreaking to watch sometimes. But as we come through some of these, there's going to be other areas that we have to continue to keep our foot on the gas. So I sense there's some fatigue out there. We can't let up on this issue, but we also have to think about what's happening in the future and how we need to position our organizations to keep our teams employed and prospering.
Last word to you, Rodrigo.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to agree first with Mitch and Colin, and I'll segregate it on my part. On the trade deals, of course, there has to be agreements, and I think with the largest U.S. partners, of course, being Europe and being China on specific. But we think it all ends with the USMCA review that sets the ground for Canada and Mexico and the United States to play with the rest of the world. No, that's on the trade part. But Colin's right. This is things are right now in an ever-changing position, and we're talking about the what and how we manufacture things, and how do we integrate those value chains within the United States and within a region. And at the end of the day, there are many, let's call it, elements of compliance. They're going to have to take part on this, and to be honest with you, I think this is going to be a process that, notwithstanding that we'll resolve the trade issues, this is a process that is going to be part of our, of course, discussions for now and the future. Again, based on what's happening in artificial intelligence, what's happening in autonomous, what's happening in humanoid. It's unbelievable we're talking about humanoid robot manufacturing, right?
Right.
But at the end of the day, part of our core processes within auto manufacturing is going to relate to that. No, as a company, we're moving into the path of these new technologies and manufacturing processes, and we think the sector is going to evolve into that, and that's why I share Con's sentiment on the future of our sector.
All right, that will do it for today. Thanks to our Congress Conversations production team, Rudy Shork, Jake Neer, Tiara Riddick, Terry Kozdrowski, and Tom Carl. A special thank you to our guests, Rodrigo Contreras with Martinrea International, Colin Shaw of MEMA Original Equipment Suppliers, and Mitch Zajac with Butzel. We really appreciate your time and perspective. That was great. For Greg Layson and everyone here at Automotive News, I'm Jamie Butters. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.